In August of 1970, I was off to summer camp, where there really weren't any phones to play with. There were no payphones, just an office phone, which I pretty much could not get to. And so, my newfound telephone interest had to be put on hold.
Oh, that's so cute.
Right. Well, anyway, the one thing I could do was to sneak in there and get the local telephone directory, paying special attention to those opening pages.
Let us turn to page VIII. It is a crime under both federal and state law to use a telephone for annoying or harassing purposes.
No, not that part. The part about dialing long distance. The directory said that to call long distance, you had to dial 1 first.
No kidding.
Dialing 1 first was unheard of to me, because in Long Island, where I lived, there was no dialing 1 first. In fact, if you tried to do it, this is what would happen. The dial tone would keep right on going as if you hadn't dialed anything. Now, there was a reason why some places had to dial 1 first for long distance and others never did, and that had to do with types of switching equipment, types of circuitry in the central office that made the telephones work. But I didn't know much about that. I had scratched the surface, though, in my early observation that some phone lines did this, a burst of dial tone at the end of the digit, and other phones did this, no dial tone burst. Of course, I was curious as to which type of phone line served the camp office. All I'd have to do is ask the lady at the office to let me use the phone. But how was I going to explain what I needed to do with the phone? So I waited until the lady was out of the office to sneak a listen to this phone. How about that, an old-fashioned dial tone? Which reminded me of the dial tone I had first heard in Long Island when I first started using the phone many years ago. And so in my mind, I went back to 1965. Dialing your own number in those days always gave you a busy signal. It was obvious that the tone of the busy signal was the same as the dial tone. Then, one day in '65, my mother, of all people, told me that the phone company had changed the dial tone. She said she didn't like the new dial tone. She described it as a high-pitched, sickening sweet sound, and she even caricatured it, making a sound like this. Well, I'm sure you can guess which dial tone it was she had in mind, but this was the first time I ever heard that sound. Now, I didn't really find the telephone interesting in those days, but I did know that the dial tone and the busy signal were the same sound. So naturally, I had to dial my own number to hear the new busy signal, which I fully expected would sound like this. So what was I going to hear when I dialed my own number? What the? Wait a minute. They changed the dial tone, right? Okay, so that means the old dial tone is gone, disconnected, kaput. I'll never hear it again, and that means the busy signal is... The old dial tone was still there, on the busy signal, even though I couldn't get it picking up the phone anymore. And that was creepy. That old, defunct dial tone, gone since 1965, had nonetheless been able to haunt me by still being on the busy signal every time I'd gotten one in the past 5 years. But here, in 1970 at camp, was a real, live, old-fashioned dial tone. And I had a mission. I wanted to find out whether that dial tone burst at the end of the digit was there, because that would tell me what type of phone line this was. Aha! I thought, this phone is just like the ones in Long Island that I like, except it has an old dial tone. And I couldn't have been more wrong, because this phone line in rural Pennsylvania was nothing like any of the phone lines in Long Island. But before I could find that out, I heard those dreaded words, "What are you doing with the phone, dear?" Well, I'm curious about the dial tone, which is old-fashioned, and I was checking the, oh boy. This new hobby was starting to put me in awkward situations. Unlike present times, where being interested in networks is instantly recognized as, oh, you're a computer geek, the 1970s had no such pigeonhole for me to fit into. Thus, I did seem pretty weird to be interested in the telephone. And maybe I was, because as I lay on my bunk bed, I was pondering the meaning of dialing numbers beginning with a 1. This idea felt to me like a whole new door opening up, and at first I couldn't see why. I did know that phone numbers and area codes in the US and Canada never began with a 1 or a 0, and that in New York, dialing a 1 would do absolutely nothing, and dialing a 0 would put a call through the operator. But then it hit me that there was something really important that I'd never tried. I had never tried picking up my phone in Long Island, dialing a foreign area code like maybe 213 for Los Angeles, and then dialing a 1. Suddenly I saw that I had missed something quite obvious. There were 200 possible phone number prefixes in the range 000 through 199 that I had never tried dialing. Of course, you couldn't dial them at the dial tone because the 1 would be ignored or the 0 would go to the operator. But after an area code, like 213, that had never been tried. And I thought about the possibility of there being special phone numbers, maybe for phone company use, beginning with 1 and 0. I got so excited about this idea that I even took a notebook and wrote down a list of all the codes that I wanted to try once I got home back to Long Island. But being at camp, for now I would just have to wait. So I made my list, waiting to fill in the results once I got home to try it. It wasn't too long after that my parents did arrive to take me back to Long Island.
Before you leave camp, why don't you short sheet their bunk beds?
Nah, I've got a better idea. On the way home from camp, I'll stop at the first payphone where I get the chance and see what happens when I dial a 1. And so I was ready for what turned out to be the first of many so-called phone trips, going up to a payphone for no purpose at all other than to check out the local telephone system. My first opportunity came in a place called Oxford, New Jersey, in western New Jersey, near the Delaware Water Gap. I do recall that in that part of the world, all the restaurants were serving a beverage called birch beer, which was a local variation on root beer. But hey, who's got time for the local cuisine? Let's get to the phone. Another old-fashioned dial tone, and this one sounded different from the camp office. Let's see what happens when I dial a 1 from this payphone.
I'm sorry, the number you have reached is changed or not in service at this time. If you need assistance, please hang up and dial your operator. This is a recording. 1-2. I'm sorry.
It was a recording, but recordings were interesting to me at this time, and this one had a funny text, the number you have reached is changed or not in service, and a mysterious numerical ID, 1-2. I couldn't help but wonder what that meant. Turns out that it was simply that this was a little independent company that didn't follow Bell System practices, and therefore it had its own way of doing recordings. Not a big deal, but at the time this whole thing was kind of mysterious and fascinating. Had I been a more experienced phone tripper, I would have been delighted to find out that as I dialed around to each of the towns that surround Belvedere, New Jersey, one of which is in Pennsylvania, I would get a different recording with its own numeric ID, 1-2 for this town, 1-4 for that town, 1-5 for another, and so on. But I wasn't to find that out for quite some time, and arriving home later that day, I just had to try those funny codes from 000 through 199, dialed after an area code. I also wanted to try dialing my own area code, 516, and then one of those codes. So I got out my list. Let's try 516 plus 111, 1111, and see what happens. To my surprise, it rang. And rang and rang.
Dialing them incorrectly, hang up and try again.
What kind of a recording was that? Let me try another one. 213-123-4567.
Dialing them incorrectly, hang up and try again.
Funny recording. It's real short, doesn't sound the same each time. Let me try another one. 215 100 1111.
Darling, I'm incorrectly. Hang up and try again.
Aha! So that wasn't a recording after all, it was an operator, and you could even hear another operator in the background. Now the other operator, when she answered, would actually ask you what number you were calling.
Reaching a special intercept. What number did you call, please?
It turned out she was there to catch people who didn't know the difference between the letters O and I and the digits 1 and 0. For example, if you told her you were calling a number in the OX7 exchange, she'd tell you to dial the O by the 6. Don't dial the operator O for Oxford 7. Same thing with the letter I. Be sure to dial the I by the 4. Don't dial a 1. And that is what my long list of prefixes came to. These operators were handling them all in all area codes. And so I thought my question about 1 and 0 codes had been answered. However, it turns out I had asked the right question and gotten the wrong answer, because this special intercept setup was the phone company's way of making sure I didn't stumble into their little secret. That when we're talking about codes beginning with 1 and 0...
That's privileged information.
You're freaking right about that, darling, but that wasn't for me to know yet. Meanwhile, some other privileged information did come my way by word of mouth. Just a local phone number, Franklin 4 9979. Obviously, this was some sort of a phone company test circuit, and I was impressed. I don't know why, but in those days, anything the phone could do that was outside of the normal repertoire tended to impress me. So I was looking for other cool numbers to dial, and I tried dialing 9979 in various prefixes around Long Island and New York City. I found that many of these test circuits sounded like Franklin 4 with slight differences, and then there were a few standouts. For example, 997 9979 in Westbury, Long Island, had kind of a sickly sound to it. Then there was 449 9979 in Brooklyn, which sounded more like a siren. .351 9979 in Newdorp, Staten Island, had a very low volume and was a little weird. .239 is a prefix in Long Island that serves the 5 towns right next to the Rockaway part of Queens. 9979 there always gave me this operator. I'd never talked to her, and then she'd put on this funny recording.
What happened when I'm calling? Hello? Please repeat the number you are calling to the special operator.
The other thing I found was that 9979 was unassigned in a lot of prefixes, and that brought me to a recording that I had never gotten before.
I'm sorry. The number you have reached is not in service or temporarily disconnected. The number you have reached is not in service at this time. This is a recording.
That was the first time I ever heard or recorded that particular recording, but certainly not the last. The voice was very familiar. It was the same voice as the recording that I got on 311, both from Neil's house, where it was a party line,
I'm sorry. We are unable to complete your call as dialed.
and mine, where it was not a party line.
I'm sorry. We are unable to complete your call as dialed.
And in the back of my mind, I knew something was just not right about that. How could the same recording be a party line in one place and not in another? But I left that mystery unsolved and kept on going out to my nearby payphone to play with the party lines.